Quilty is brought to you by APQS, handcrafted quilting machines. Aurifil Italian thread, perfectly suited for all your quilting projects. Baby Lock, for the love of sewing. Clothworks, inspiring creativity with art on fabric. Hovels Sewing, when you need to cut it close, choose Hovels. P&B, our fabrics, your lifestyle. Quiltology, the urban quilt space.
Quilty.
On today's episode of Quilty, we're going to have a little one-on-one chat and compare a handmade, homemade quilt with a prefabricated one. Let's take a look. Welcome to Quilty. Today's episode is a little something different. I'd like to call it a fireside chat. We're going to have a little talk with you, and I know everyone watching Quilty, well I hope so, is an aficionado, a quilt fan. Maybe you've never made a quilt before, but you're ready to take the plunge. This episode today is going to kind of compare a real quilt versus a prefab quilt for any of your friends who might be thinking about buying a quilt at, say, a department store or a store that might rhyme with the word schmanthropology, something like that. You know that that's not what you want to do, but you might need a little bit of ammunition to tell your friend or your relative why they shouldn't do that either, and maybe why you both should go and explore quilt making for yourself and make a quilt instead of buying one from a store, okay? So, I happen to have a prefabricated quilt here. It comes in plastic. Whatever. It's fine. This is what a prefabricated quilt looks like. This is one example of them. And something that I want to say right away, I want to be sensitive to the fact that these quilts that come to you in a store, it's not that there's a button pushed and a robot spits out a quilt. I understand that there are people who work in these factories that make these prefabricated quilts, these fabrication places, right? There are actually people who work there, often overseas, who are behind these quilts. There are people involved. So we, have compassion for that, and we understand that and respect that, and that is what it is. But there's a difference between working to make a quilt in that way and working to make a quilt with your hands, with your own hands, okay? So we just understand that, wanted to be politically correct because it's important. When you are looking at a prefabricated quilt versus a real one, this is a real one. When by real, I mean it was handmade. I know the person who made this quilt. She's a friend of mine, so that already makes it kind of special, right? Because it's like my friend made this quilt, and that's exciting. You can't feel these two quilts at home, but I'm going to tell you. I'm going to feel them for you and sort of tell you what I'm feeling, and then we're going to take a closer look. So the quilt that was handmade by someone that I know, and this quilt reminds me of her because it's some of her favorite fabrics, and it's her style and her taste. So it's like, oh yeah, I look at this quilt and I think about my friend. So I'm feeling it, I'm sort of touching it. It's really soft. There's a lot of weight to it. There's weight to this quilt because it's been worked in a machine, it's been worked by hand. The binding, right, the finished edge is really strong. I mean, this binding isn't going anywhere because it was turned by hand. And, probably a favorite movie was turned on the TV, maybe some chips or something, and finishing the binding. We're going to do that on an episode of Quilty. I know that work went into finishing this quilt on the binding. The prefabricated quilt, it's very fluffy. It's sort of extra fluffy. And it has batting inside of it, just like the real quilt or the handmade quilt. But the sewing, the quilting, because a quilt is a sandwich, it's 3 layers. In a handmade quilt, it's very strong because that quilting sews it all together, keeps it all together, and it's like not going anywhere. That's why quilts are heirlooms, because they're really strong. In the prefab quilt, the quilting doesn't actually even go all the way through. The top is stitched together, but it's not really quilted sort of on the back. So I'm not sure how they did that. And the batting inside is very loose, so that's what gives it the loft. Like it's this really fluffy quilt, but it's not going to hold up in the washing machine in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. How long will a handmade quilt last? A long, long time. The prefabricated quilt won't. You can tell if a quilt is prefabricated because this is a pretty good sign, right? It has a tag. It has a tag on it and washing instructions. That's a good way to tell if you're dealing with a quilt that has been made in a factory. And by the way, the cost is sometimes what people think about when they're taking a look at whether they want to buy a quilt or make one. They're like, oh, it costs so much to make a quilt, or it takes so much time. It's true that it would take longer for you to make a real quilt, a quilt by yourself. It takes time to make a quilt. That's why they're important. That's why we love them, because it shows that time was taken on this thing. It's much faster to buy a prefabricated quilt, but the cost is actually not that different. Some of the quilts I saw at Smanthropology were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars. I was like, wow, that's a lot of money. You could make a quilt for that much or much less than some of these prefabricated quilts. If you buy fabric or have your friends sort of give you some scraps to use, you could probably put a quilt together for that much or less. It just is the time. The time is the difference. The fact of the matter is, you can't make absolutely everything by hand. Well, maybe you can, but who does? Diapers, clothing, furniture, automobiles. I mean, you can do a lot yourself, but it's a good thing that people make things in factories that when we can buy, that's a good thing. You can't make everything by yourself, or we wouldn't be, texting. If you did everything by yourself, you don't have any time to do anything else. So that's fine. But when it comes to a quilt, why? Why? I'm reaching over this. I'm reaching toward you. Why buy a quilt that has been made by someone far, far away using shoddy materials and, maybe won't last more than like a year or two, when you can make your own? You can make your own quilt. You can choose the fabric. You can choose the thread. You can choose your pattern, and you can maybe find that you love to make quilts, that quilts allow you to be creative and allow you to express yourself in a design way. Being a designer, being a person a quilt maker, and that's a pretty important thing. So make your own quilt, and if you have a friend who is thinking about buying a quilt, send her the link, and I'll convince her myself. Okay, it means a lot to us, and the quilts that you make will last a lot longer than any other quilts you could buy. So follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Visit the website. Go to your local quilt shop and look around, and join us again for another episode of Quilty, where we show you how to make these gorgeous handmade quilts. See you later.
Quilty is brought to you by APQS, handcrafted quilting machines. Aurifil Italian thread, perfectly suited for all your quilting projects. Baby Lock, for the love of sewing. Clothworks, inspiring creativity with art on fabric. Hovels Sewing, when you need to cut it close, choose Hovels. E&B, our fabrics, your lifestyle. Quiltology, the urban quilt space.